Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a couple of minutes, letting everyone join. Glad to see those of you who are hopping on. Thanks for being here. Vanessa, are we looking at about 20 guests today? We'll give it one more minute and then we will get started. We are recording this and we will share the link after. Anna, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think it's time to get started. Let's honor everybody's time. Hi, everyone. My name is Meredith Hendricks. I'm the Executive Director at the Land Trust for Santa Barbara County. Thank you for joining us at today's Lunch and Learn. Our Lunch and Learns are an annual series of fun and hopefully interactive educational experiences, which we run from February to July. And they're open to anyone who's interested in learning about our work. And we really appreciate that you all have joined us today. We are going to have a conversation about how California is leading new models for conservation. What does that really mean and who's involved and what is it going to take to achieve the kind of conservation that planet Earth really needs right now in order to remain a sustainable place to live. Our presenter today is one of my favorite people. This is really a treat to have her. I'm going to read her bio. Dr. Ana M. Alvarez serves as the Deputy General Manager of the East Bay Regional Park District, the largest local park agency in the United States. Ana's professional accomplishments demonstrate a strong acumen for proactive and meaningful civic engagement, community building based on public trust, and sustainability planning based on science, which she believes is paramount to the vibrancy of healthy communities. She contributes to the profession by ushering in the next generation of parks and recreation directors across the nation by serving as faculty in the Director's School for the National Recreation and Park Association, focusing on conservation, the role of local governments on issues of othering and belonging, and strategically positioning open space as natural capital for nature-based solutions. And we'll get into talking about what that means. What is a nature-based solution? Ana is also part of the stewardship of the University of California's Natural Reserve System. We have that here in Santa Barbara as part of UCSB. And it's a network comprised of 756,000 acres of natural areas throughout California. She's just joined the board of directors at Point Blue Conservation Science, a leading conservation science group based up in the Bay Area. And Anna holds a doctoral degree in policy planning and development from the University of Southern California. Go Trojans. I know we have a couple of Trojans on this call, if they can hear me. Her doctoral dissertation focused on San Francisco's park and open space sustainability plan, establishing climate change adaptation strategies, for which the former Mayor Ed Lee, bestowed upon her San Francisco's Green Pioneer Award. And Anna, welcome. It's my pleasure to have you here today. And you and I go back to that time when you were doing work in San Francisco. That's when we first met.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I remember those times with a lot of, I cherished that time in San Francisco with you.
So I think at this point, Anna has some slides she's going to share with us and lead us through a conversation. Can we give it back to Anna so she can get her presentation up? And we will have time at the end for questions as we talk. If we mention a word you don't understand, a concept you don't understand, please put it in the chat. We'll keep an eye on the chat. It's a good time to put yourself on mute if you're not on mute already. And Anna, that is spectacular.
Are you seeing the beautiful green space that surrounds me in my day-to-day living here?
It reminds me of where I used to do work up in the Bay Area before I came to Santa Barbara County.
Yes, yes. Santa Barbara is absolutely gorgeous. And thank you so much for the introduction, Meredith. We miss you terribly here in San Francisco Bay Area. But these are the heels of the East Bay. And this is really what motivated me into focusing on really how do we position correctly the land, not just from an aesthetic value or the merit of its own beauty, but rather align it correctly with a very aggressive environmental agenda that is being presented by our governor today and a few years ago. So this is really what motivates me and keeps me going, gorgeous piece of land. And I'll share with you another setting to give you a context as to when we manage this land, what are we looking at? But keeping it in perspective, it's very humbling to be a public servant. I've been in the profession for 30 years, and I am unapologetically a bureaucrat. I am a public servant at heart because I really fundamentally believe in the good of government, in doing the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people, to influence not only what's happening today in our generations, in which the time and the moment in which we live, but mostly also to think about the decisions that we make that have an impact in the future. So I always say, when I was problem solving around with you, Meredith, the issues around Golden Gate Park,
Yes,
which was tremendous.
Yes,
people have very strong feelings about that park. But as we were problem solving through those issues, I often said to staff, it's really about the decisions that were made by people before us 50 years ago. It was about the decisions from John McLaren. It was the decisions from William Hammond Hall about trying to restore or reimagine those sand dunes and creating a new park, even at a time when Olmsted was saying that there was nothing that could be built in those sand dunes in San Francisco. So Olmsted had a vision, and he saw that we can have that beautiful park. So keeping it in perspective of what we do today, I like to share these slides with people because it's, as I share with you the slides of the East Bay, this is what my friends think that I do, that I go around with Meredith, when Meredith was here on a horseback.
I thought it was donkeys. I thought we had donkeys up in the East Bay.
No, no, but no, I don't go around the horseback looking at the land or managing the land. When I talk around the Christmas table with my father that I'm still in Parks and Recreation, he literally tells me, "You're still in recreation. I thought you were doing summer camps when you were in high school." And yes, I was doing summer camps in high school, but my job is very different and my role is very different now. And this is when I talk and I meet people and I say I'm in the field of Parks and Recreation. They constantly quickly shift to what's on television, pop culture. It says, "Oh, are you like Leslie making those funny decisions with the community?" Sometimes. And when I'm doing stakeholder meetings, There are some people in our communities, as Meredith knows, when we have a very engaged stakeholders, very engaged people that have very strong opinions, they look at me being a 30-year career public servant or a bureaucrat. They really think that being part of government, this is really what I must do, since we're not resolving for those thorny issues around parks. And then from time to time, like moments like today, I like to think that what I do is about crystallizing concepts to galvanize people and to share a vision of what the future can be. And that in fact, I can galvanize and create hope and speak of a future that can have meaning and be relevant to the issues of what we're trying to resolve for today. But as Meredith knows, most of the days, this is what I come to, and this is what I'm dealing with, a huge inbox of emails and processes and systems that I really need to do so that I can correctly affect my work. So this is a reality, and I'm keeping it in perspective. And I like to share this slide only because it can be overwhelming when you start thinking about the concepts of conservation today, or when you start talking about the adverse impacts of climate change. So, this, when we think about the natural world and we think about the open lands, the redwood forests that continue to exist here in the East Bay and the San Francisco Bay Area, there's no other place in the world other than China and the Western California, Northern California area, where you can find redwood trees. And so the decision and the choice for me to come and contribute to the land and the stewardship of the environmental stewardship of these lands it's very meaningful to me, and it's very intentional and strategic. And this is the view of parks, what I like to see. But this is also a very conventional picture. And I share it because when we think about the conservation movement, and we think about the history of the conservation movement, this is really the iconic image of people when I engage with communities. We think about those beautiful, inspiring, and even magical landscapes. And we think of ourselves as that being very young in this mystical space under the fog line, and look at the possibilities for future generations. But if we focus more closely into this picture, it's about widening our perspective with an attention to the fact that we're contributing to a global issue of the nature-based solutions in our Mother Earth, but acting regionally. So I go back to the notion of the beginning of the environmental movement, to think about these issues globally, but you need to act locally. And when we think about nature-based solutions or a new conservation movement, it's not even locally anymore, it's about acting regionally. So with your concurrence, Meredith, I'm going to step back a little bit and think about these issues globally. And I'd like to share a quick video that inspires me when I think about my work and our work that we do collectively. So it's a very powerful image, and I like to be silent during that moment because it's really about Mother Earth breathing. But with the ongoing degradation of those natural systems, we see that it's running out of breath. And I love that image because it really speaks about not only us as humans having to live in this planet, but also about thinking from the perspective of one of my mentors and a person that I admire greatly, John Jarvis, who was the former National Park Services director. When he thinks about these issues, he says there's no hope without action, and let the greatest action be rooted in compassion for all species, not just our own. So we think about the tiniest of organisms that perhaps may be our own salvation, and also to think about those systems, those living creatures without a voice. So it's not just about centering us humans into resolving for these very difficult issues that come with the changing climate, but also to think about all those living creatures that depend on the decisions that we make today, and Mother Earth depending on our decisions. And this image of the Earth not being able to breathe is also very iconic and very relevant to the intersectionality of the moment in time in which we're living. When we think about these issues from a cultural perspective, with the movement on equity, when we saw the fact that even some communities of colors cannot continue to breathe with the institutionalized racism in our communities today, even in the conservation movement.
Anna, can we start for a second to do a little bit of definitions?
Yes.
So there's two things, because I think it's going to come up a few times. One is, when you talk about nature-based solutions, what does that actually mean? And when you say the word intersectionality as it relates to this conservation movement, what does that mean?
Certainly. The nature-based solutions in the simplest of forms is the ability to humans to benefit from those ecological systems that have been ignored or have not been aligned correctly to resolve for very difficult issues, either through adaptation to some of the climate changes that we're seeing, or mitigation to those changes that come with an adverse climate. So for instance, to give a real example, when we think about the beautiful slide that I shared with the redwood forests, we know that the redwood trees, that species of trees, I should say, is perhaps the one species of trees that can absorb and contain the most amount of carbon or carbon dioxide that helps maintain clean air and quality of the air. But when we don't manage them correctly and we don't manage those redwood forests, then they contribute to the degradation of the environment, because then they catch on fire and they contribute to wildfire smoke, and they contribute to the degradation of air quality. So nature-based solutions is about managing correctly in a sustainable way those natural resources that exist in a natural world, but you have to strategically enhance them and put them to work so that they can help us alleviate from some of those issues that we're seeing today. And when I say the intersectionality, I mean really when the world, when we come together in that moment and we integrate systems, or we integrate functions, because there isn't anything that lives and works and stands alone, especially in the conservation movement and especially in the natural world. Everything's interconnected, including us humans and including us as the diversity that is found within our humanity. So when I say the intersectionality of culture and with the environment, and so this next slide really speaks to that. It's about what has been defined as the ecological or the ecocultural identity, when we have to think about ourselves us being humans, being part of this natural world. So we go back to the indigenous tribes when they really looking back at the original natives, that they thought of the natural world as coexisting and being part of that natural world. We were not separate from that world. We were part of that world as humans. And then this perspective that has changed through time, and I'm going to share with you the transitional points. Then we think about preservation. When we saw all of a sudden in the cultural narrative in the conservation movement, you hear people like John Muir, you hear people like President Theodore Roosevelt, who were discovering the natural world or rediscovering the natural world. And they were putting into action concepts like we must preserve this geographic and geological assets or these landscapes for the merit in terms of the beauty that they bring versus the built environments. It was about protection. And here we saw a very the dichotomy of protecting versus allowing it to be built. And as we continue to move in history, we see that in the 1950s, we saw the conservation movement when we started feeling and understanding the impacts that we were having or that built environment was having on the land, on the natural assets, or on the natural world. When we actually, if you think about it, looking back in history, we actually saw rivers being caught on fire because of all the chemicals and the discharges that we were putting into those rivers, and water caught on fire. And that's when we saw the greatest amount of environmental legislation coming into play to conserve and to understand and minimize and mitigate the impact that we were having on the environment. And now, as we're moving to today's time, we see that this conservation movement was thinking about, again, a dichotomy of a separation of built versus not built, protecting versus not protecting, conserving versus using. And in reality, what California is leading in thinking about a new conservation movement or redefining conservation, we're leaning into science. And we're saying, wait a minute, these ecological services, these ecological systems can be aligned correctly to be the solutions that we need. Looking back into the natural world provides us with those solutions that we need to be able to mitigate for those very difficult impacts that we're seeing from a changing climate, whether it's sea level rise or whether it's the king tides or the flooding that comes from those extreme weather events that we're seeing more and more often, and those extreme precipitation patterns, or the drought, or even those wildfires. And then I would tell you, and this is what California is leading with in their movement for preserving 30% of water, coastal waters, and 30% of California's lands by 2030. And even in that discussion and in that movement, there's that that thought about, well, isn't it going back to the original moment in time where the indigenous tribes and the indigenous people were telling us to exist in the one natural world? And it's about understanding that we're part of that natural world and that we can have a shift in thinking about these issues from an ecocultural or ecocentric perspective. And I know these are a lot of new terminology, but this is also, Meredith, I'm very excited because this also speaks to the intersection of sciences. The conservation world truly and rightfully looked at the environmental sciences, and we have seen a lot of advancement in the sciences from environmental sciences. But now we're living in a moment of time when we're seeing not only the environmental sciences, but we're also seeing the social sciences.
Yes. When
they come together, because it's about people in a natural environment.
I think, would it be fair to say, Anna, that we're moving past thinking of Now I'm thinking about conservation on this side of a wall, and on the other side of the wall, I'm thinking about development and growth and economic vibrancy. And what we're really saying is that that's an artificial wall that needs to come down, and
Yes.
that our work as conservation professionals is to integrate the concepts of, habitat preservation and all those things you think of as classically conservation with the reality that they're also part of the economic engine, they're part of human health. They have to do with basic functions of clean air, clean water, and keeping this a livable place. But to ignore or not integrate the social reality of where we live and whose voices are heard leaves some of our most powerful tools to get this work done together. It leaves it out. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely. You said it so well, Meredith. It speaks to not only the now, but it also speaks to the future.
Yes.
Because I often say to people, we come from a shared perspective, a perspective of shared values. All of us in this room, in this space that we're occupying, we all believe and value the natural world in that beautiful environment. That's a beautiful starting point. But who's going to be here 20 years from today? Who's going to be here 50 years from today? Who are the Californians who we're going to have to entrust that they can continue to steward these lands in perpetuity? Mm-hmm. And so you have to think about the future. So and you think about the demographical shifts in California. So in 2050, the majority of the people are going to be people of color, communities of color. And so you have to start inviting people and understanding the cultural connections of people to the natural world and the environment. And I often say, when we talk about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion or belonging, I often say it's not when we talk about these issues and communities of color, it's not at the exclusion of white people.
Right.
And that's such an important notion. We're not excluding anyone. It's actually the opposite. We're saying, let's all come together, all of us. And if we really care for this land that we have sacrificed so much and we have given so much, we have to understand that every single culture, I have yet to find one culture that doesn't have a connection to nature or to the environment.
Right. We all have a personal relationship to the environment, and we all have a way of being in that. And I've said for a long time that my job is people and the subject is parks being sort of a catch-all for open space or conservation. In other words, to your slide about how you spend your day, I don't get to go running through fields of flowers every day. I spend my day in meetings trying to have these conversations and seek complicated solutions for the challenges that we're facing. Anyway, we should keep moving. I know we're halfway through our time.
So if we're going to, in this new conservation movement that we're proposing and that we're envisioning, it can be a very impactful shift. And I talk about us. It's not them versus us, it's us, all of us together collectively. Right. So again, it's about the intersection of, like you said, Meredith, people and communities and the land and the natural world. It's about understanding the ecocultural equity where we have, and I'll speak to in a minute more about cultural humility. And when we understand the notion of nature-based solutions, and I have to say that even nature-based solutions, it's difficult for some communities of color to understand that, to embrace that concept. They understand it, but it's difficult for them to embrace it because it's very human-centered. I have had conversations with folks that tell me, for you to think that you're going to daylight the creek so that we can have recreational enjoyment and we can have clean water and all those benefits to the humans, that's very selfish and that's very human-centered, when in fact there is merit to the natural life of the creek. And that's how the indigenous folks saw nature. So they're ecosystems that we want to steward, not necessarily eco-services. Mm-hmm. And we have to lean into the science, because while I said that there's every single community and culture has a connection with the natural world, there's many opinions and there's many values, and there's many perspectives. But really, if we focus on the science, both on the environmental science and on the social sciences, we will have a better pathway so that we can be truly strategic in our decisions that we make today for a future of 50 years from now, that we can be relevant to the moment in time in which we're living. And that is so critical. And I'll speak to why that is so critical today. And it has to have action behind it. Yes. So I don't mind spending a lot of difficult times along with you, Meredith, in meetings, rather than being out there in the land or getting into on the back of a horse to look at the possibility of a new canyon that can be saved. I don't mind spending my time in difficult stakeholder meetings if it's going to result in new legislation and new budget allocations into actionable things that contribute to the whole. So we talked about 30 by 30, and I know we're going to talk more about that in a moment. But I just want to share with you that I love this slide because the governor's executive order to preserve 30% of the coastal waters and 30% of the land in California by 2030, it's done in a systems perspective. It's about creating climate resiliency through nature-based solutions. It's about protecting those ecological systems through the protection of biodiversity. And it's also about understanding that we have to increase access so that we can be inviting to all Californians. So this picture speaks to recreation, as you can see on the back, and it speaks to the natural beauty, and there is access without disturbing those ecological systems. I grew up in Southern California and I worked in Santa Barbara. I was very blessed to have worked there for the city of Santa Barbara for about 6 years of my career. And I'm very knowledgeable and understand very well how all those things come together and how it can be balanced. But it takes all of us working together. So if we're really going to make a difference and have an impactful shift, we have to lean into the science. And I share with you here, Point Blue Conservation Science is leading the conversations in California as to the intersectionality of all these concepts to create this balance without leaving anyone behind. And so, and when we talk about equity and thinking about Californians in terms of tearing down those barriers or doing no harm, and that is so critical, doing no harm. It takes all of us, and no one has the answer. But I love this image. As you know me, Meredith, I'm a very humble person, and it took me a long time to allow my image to be used and to center myself into these conversations. But I made an exception here. This is on the California Biodiversity Network website, because this is a very strong image, and images are very powerful. So here's the former National Park Services Director, John Jarvis, who perhaps is the one director that did the most for national parks other than John Muir. This is what I said, it's very critical. Mm-hmm. He has done so much for our national parks and addressing these issues of equity and all these things. But he now has come to the table and is contributing in his retirement. He continues to work for free, mind you. And here he is coming at the center of the discussion by two women, which you typically wouldn't see in the conservation movement, and then two women of color to have that difficult conversation to understand the issues of equity. So let me talk a little bit about cultural humility. And I shared this transition perspective in transition when I started my career in public service. In Girl Scouting, mind you, I remember talking about and developing a curriculum to talk about cultural tolerance. And I wrote a curriculum nationwide for the US, the Girl Scouts of the United States. And I wrote a white paper saying tolerance that has many meanings. And while that tolerance is the term that was used back in the early 1980s, and I'm dating myself, it speaks of awareness, but it's tolerating something that doesn't belong. Right. And so that was difficult for me. And so I wrote about it. And and I taught about it and I spoke about that concept. But it was about awareness and making space and tolerating something that is not welcome. Then as time went by, the terminology changed to diversity. And in the 1990s, we spoke about celebrating diversity. And so that moved in the transition spectrum to acknowledgement that perhaps there is value to the differences that we all bring to the table, that we are diverse. So when we think about biodiversity and how powerful that is for healthy ecosystems, that's also true when we think about humans. The more diverse in perspectives, the more diversity of thought and diversity of experiences, the more powerful that we can be in problem solving. But we still didn't see people really at the table. So now the conversation has moved to inclusion. And it's even diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. And inclusion speaks of inviting people at the table. It's an acknowledgement to say, well, not everybody here is included, and maybe they're in the room to make decisions and participate in the decision-making process, but they need to have the same amount of equity in terms of amplifying the voices or augmenting the opportunities so that the voice can be heard. And that is even shifting more to the concepts of belonging. Because I say that while you might be invited, and mind you, having steward and having been a leader in the new, along with Meredith, so thank you, Meredith, in the new parks that are enjoyed today by the children of San Francisco, it took many years to get there. And Meredith was part of that with me. But I remember spending $13 million about 7 years ago for Lafayette Park. It's a beautiful park in Presidio Heights. And I've been in charge of all those parks in San Francisco. I visited right after it was newly renovated with my family, and I still didn't feel that I belong because the only signs in Spanish were don't litter, pick up your trash, and don't come in here into the tennis courts unless you have a permit. And mind you, I, along with Meredith, advocated and got the money, saw that capital project improvement, and continued to steward the park. And I still didn't feel that I would belong because I was the only person of color that day in that park on a Sunday with my children. So when we think about belonging, it's about how we invite people and how do they live or enjoy that space like we all do. So we have to understand that there are some cultures that may hike differently than we do. And it's about the strength that comes with the collective impact. So this is a powerful image. People of color can be invited and we are aware that they exist and we can acknowledge them as long as they're there on that trail doing removal of invasive species, because that's how we relate to the land today in the conservation movement. But this is a picture I took about understanding belonging. These are children that came to Coyote Hills Regional Park. And there's about 9 languages spoken in that group of school children, none of them which is Spanish. There was Arabic, Hindi, and German, and other languages, but not Spanish. So it requires cultural humility from my part. I'm never going to be culturally competent, which was a term in the 1990s in the Muslim culture. That's a very high bar, but I can have humility to understand that there is a culture, that there are beliefs, that there are traditions, and that there's a connection to the environment. And I would like to understand what that is so that I can make sure that when children from the Muslim community come to enjoy the parks and start seeing the history, the cultural resources, that they can relate and that they can value those resources. And when we resolve for very difficult issues of access and how people hike in those parks, we're living in a generation, in a moment of time when people are no longer asking for permission, which was, again, I'm going to date myself. When I was coming up in the profession, I come from a generation when we asked for permission. We waited to be invited. And now I'm working with a new generation that is not waiting to be invited and is not asking for permission. they're demanding, and they're taking action. So this is who's hiking and accessing the land, and I still have a responsibility that they understand and that they can steward the land 50 years from today.
And so we have about 20 minutes left, and we want to make sure that we have time for questions and some dialogue. But we've mentioned the 30 by 30 initiative, which is an effort to fund conservation so that we can protect 30% of California's lands and waters by 2030. It's very ambitious.
Yes.
That's what 30 by 30 means. Here in California, that means about 6 million more acres of conservation. Santa Barbara County has a population of just over about 450,000 people. We occupy 2,700 square miles, or about 1.7 million acres. We have a lot of land that hasn't been developed yet. We have a lot of opportunity to conduct conservation that really meets the needs of the planet, but also the needs of the societies that live here and will live here in the future. And part of the point I think you're making, Anna, is that if we only do things the way we've been doing things, we're really living in the past. Yeah. And to meet the needs, both in terms of climate resilience and sort of socially, we really need to be thinking about what belonging and inclusion means towards the future. Yes? Absolutely.
So well said. Thank you.
And so here is a state budget that has not been finished, but already we know the minimum investment for the state of California is $3.7 billion in climate resilience, of which $768 million is for these nature-based solutions. Here in Santa Barbara County, we have coastal salt marshes. We're going to be dealing with sea level rise. We have incredible rangelands, grasslands that can be managed. But also $600 million for coastal adaptation, including $500 million for the Coastal Conservancy. So as the land trust, when we think about where and how we conserve land and who the voices are in the room to make those decisions, we know there's money coming. If you were us here in Santa Barbara County, what kinds of things would you be thinking about in terms of making the decisions that weave together the concepts you've addressed today with the fact that we do have a lot of resources coming our way to make this work happen?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Meredith. That's a very good question. And it's a question that I often ask staff here at the East Bay Regional Park District. So how do we align the land so that for it to be relevant and have value to the environmental agenda set by the state, so that we can position those lands ready to be for funding allocation and funding opportunities. So the best thing that we can do is understand what we're managing in terms of land, not only in size, but the ecosystems that exist within those lands. And so the California Natural Resources Agency has provided a tool. It's called California Nature, that gives you an understanding, and you can go into the website and look at the lands that are being stored by the Santa Barbara Land Trust and understand that land from a biological perspective to see what is the biodiversity that exists, to understand the land in terms of the eco services that are needed for the nature-based solutions, so that you can speak of your land and say, we stored 44,000 acres of grasslands that sequester so much amount of carbon. Mm-hmm. And that the carbon sink of a metropolitan, Santa Barbara is, the greater Santa Barbara region is actually a metropolitan. And we don't think about Santa Barbara that way. Back in the time when I was there, we didn't think about only the city of Santa Barbara or the county of Santa Barbara. It was the greater Santa Barbara area. So it's thinking about it regionally. Mm-hmm. So you can say, this is the open space and the green spaces of, and I don't know the population right now. The time that I was there was about 286,000 people.
It's 450 now.
Oh, look at that. Oh my gosh. So it's, so these are the green spaces of 450,000 people, and this is where they're getting their clean air. And this is where we're receiving our clean waters and the watersheds. To think about it the opposite way is also very valuable. in aligning for resource allocation from the state. Because if you don't manage that open space correctly, if you don't do the natural resource management, or sometimes the reconciliation, and that's another big term, to enhance those eco services and do the work that needs to be done in that land so that it can have those ecosystems be thriving and working well. What happens is that that degraded land that has been used for agricultural systems, agricultural use for many years, because that becomes a detriment to the state. So if you're not managing correctly, it becomes a box of matches ready to catch fire for the next wildfire season that will contribute to the carbon, the greenhouse gases in California. So, and undo all the environmental good work that was done by others. So you have to look at it from that duality and be able to speak to it on both sides. So if you don't manage it correctly, this is what's going to happen. And if you manage it correctly, this is the value that it brings to the state.
I think also that speaks to the idea that conservation isn't static. You just don't protect something and then move on. It's an ongoing relationship, and you have to evolve the way you do this work.
Absolutely.
So curious if anybody who's joining us on the Zoom live, as opposed to the recording, has questions or comments for Anna or any of the topics that we're discussing right now. If you want to either raise your hand or put them in the chat, we'd love to get you engaged in the conversation. We won't put any pressure on you. We can keep talking, but if anybody has something they'd like to say.
So, you know, I'll share with the group. When I was coming up, Meredith and I have known each other for almost going on 15 years.
Yeah.
I know time just goes by so quickly. But Meredith, I'm very grateful because she was with me in a moment in time in my life when I was trying to finish my doctoral dissertation on climate science 15 years ago.
Yeah.
You believe that, Meredith?
Yeah.
And so when the science was so new, and Meredith sat in the in my community panel, or my panel to give validity to the work that I was and the concepts that I was putting together with my dissertation. And in doing that work, I came to understand very quickly that these issues are can be overwhelming, and at times can be very depressing. And over the years, I've learned to, and this is my advice to every single person that's contributing to this, that's part of this movement today, and is part of this reality in trying to make that shift, is that you have to take the time to focus on the solutions that are before us and to chart that new way and to be an advocate and a catalyst for that change, and not to be overwhelmed by the doomsday scenario or an apocalyptic scenario. Even though I would tell you it was very scary during the pandemic, early in the pandemic for COVID 2019, that in 2020, we saw here in the Bay Area, Meredith, I don't know if you remember, and we woke up to an orange sky.
I do remember. I was being interviewed by Katie for our newsletter to welcome me as the new executive director, and the sun didn't come up that day because there was so much smoke. It was dark outside.
Yeah. So we woke up and it was very apocalyptic and can be very overwhelming because we know what this means for us understanding climate change mitigation and adaptation. But my best advice is we need to start thinking about an amazing moment in time in which we're living, because while we've never had such a difficult crisis or experienced such a crisis before, we've never had a better opportunity than the times that we're living today.
Yeah.
We've never had such an amazing allocation of resources.
Yep.
And a very strong environmental agenda coming from the governor. So California is leading the way and is leading the nation. So let's all lean into that and do as much as we can while we still have time to do this.
So we've gotten a couple of questions. One is directly related to that, and that is, who are the agencies or organizations that we as the Land Trust for Santa Barbara County are working with on 30 by 30? Certainly, I want to make sure that Santa Barbara County benefits from those incredible resources. We're calling this once in a lifetime level of conservation funding. What we're doing is we're members of the California Council of Land Trusts, and we participate in working groups that are helping to define the funding sources that will come down and become available for conservation in the county. In general, we partner with the Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, the California Rangeland Trust, and we work closely with any organization that's addressing conservation in the county. We're also active participants in the countywide recreation master planning process to make sure that we're keeping an eye on recreation, connectivity, expansion of open space into areas that are not well served. We've added program staff to our organization that are externally facing folks. Leslie's on this Zoom right now, and her job is to make connections and seek collaborations that allow us to not only bring the dollars to conservation in Santa Barbara County, but help us make really good choices about the land that we conserve. So that's what we're doing at this point. The full amount of money that will be available for protecting 30% of California hasn't been fully decided. The governor will finish with budget negotiations this month, and by August we'll know a lot more about the magnitude of the money we're talking about. It's over and above that 3.7 billion I mentioned. Second question is, Doreen, do you have a follow-up on that real quick?
No, I'm just, well, the only thing is, I'm very excited to learn the Santa Barbara Land Trust is really turning towards the partnerships that we need, because it's a regional and a collective impact, because not one agency can do all of this by themselves.
Well,
so
it also it's inefficient if we're all kind of doing what we think is what we should be doing, but we're not talking to each other. And I prefer to, exponentially improve things rather than sort of bump into each other because we didn't know we were doing the same thing. Yeah. Another question is, what's your recommendation for someone who's interested in making change but unsure about what route to go, as in government work versus private or nonprofit? I'll say I couldn't survive in the work that you do, Anna. My hat's off to you as a bureaucrat, because I need the fresh air of the nonprofit, nimble, crazy as it is environment. But if somebody's starting to think about where they want to go, I really think, ask yourself what you need in terms of support, risk tolerance, consistency. What would you say are some factors in how to decide what kind of work to get into for conservation?
The best thing that I can share is that it has to have meaning to you, and it has to, your work must matter, because conservation, to your point, Meredith, is not static. It continuously evolves, and it's getting more and more complicated. So the work has to speak to you as an individual, to the things that make you get up in the morning, because as the issues get really complicated, and I appreciate Meredith's comments to me, it's very difficult to work in government, and but it's something, it's perhaps the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life, and it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life. And I also wonder about Meredith, who chooses to go into the nonprofit world, because here, I have the responsibility to steward and to make decisions on the subsidies that come from the taxpayers, which weighs very heavily, and it's a huge responsibility. And we continue to tax people, and I'm very sensitive to that. And I have very difficult conversations with staff. And but I also think about Meredith's work, where she has to be constantly looking at how to have a fiscally sustainable organization so that the trust can continue doing its work. And resolve for all these issues. Mm-hmm. So the choices that you make, they have to be your choices. I would highly recommend that you do take time to make a strategic decision for you, rather than stumbling into the work. There's a lot of people that stumble into conservation, really, and then they get discouraged, or they're working against these new concepts because it's not the world that they thought it was. So if you're comfortable with change, it's conservation. So, but I would highly encourage you to spend time doing internships and spend time understanding how what is the daily life of a person in government, versus nonprofit or even in the private sector doing restorations, ecological restorations.
Here's another question. Oh, thanks for the advice. And Allison, we're here if you want to get coffee or have a Zoom date, we can do that. What I was talking with somebody yesterday about who wants to get into conservation, he was asking me, what do you need? What kind of skills do you need? And everybody thinks we need, somebody who is an incredible native plant person or an incredible, but really I said, what I need are qualified real estate appraisers.
Yes.
We can't get this land appraised fast enough to move quickly in this real estate market. We've got some deals in the pipeline, and the first available appraiser I can get who understands how to value areas in Santa Barbara County can't start until September. So I said, go become a realtor. We just brought in our own in-house realtor. Kim is on this Zoom right now. She's our new land transactions manager, because that's the nuts and bolts of how this work happens for the land trust, is that we're like a specialty science and community-based real estate firm.
Yes.
That goes on hikes. It's this complicated stuff. Okay, here's another question. Would the land trust consider working with MTD to offer busing out to Arroyo Hondo Preserve to extend opportunities and invite more folks? Yes, so I think that we could expand the way that we get folks out to Arroyo Hondo Preserve. Currently, the Land Trust does get grant funding to pay for busing for schools and groups that want to come, where busing would be a barrier. I think we could look at ways to expand that, especially now that people are getting back into buses. For a while, we weren't using buses. But the other thing that we recognize as an organization is that one preserve located on the Gaviota Coast is not enough to serve the county as a whole. So we are in some pretty serious due diligence on a potential preserve for the Santa Maria Valley. And then we're also exploring opportunities to provide additional recreation space or possible preserve space more in the Santa Ynez area, so that we really can, this is a huge county. Our county seat is 70 miles north of here, and we can't just have one place for people to go. So reducing barriers to getting there, and also placing these places closer to where people live. Okay, we have 3 more minutes if we're going to be on time before Vanessa ends the meeting for all of us. Do we have other questions related to the amount of funding that's coming in, how Santa Barbara County might leverage it, how we are working to make sure that we have a sense of belonging and that everyone within our county is active in these conversations? And what I like to say is that we are an organization where everyone sees themselves represented, and where they feel like the conservation we are doing is really truly of everyone. And that's a lift. That's not an easy thing to do. And that's not a just check the box thing. It's a journey that we're on as an organization. All right. I don't see any other questions. So Anna, I just want to thank you for your time today and for your leadership in helping bring California to the next phase of conservation. Part of the take home for me is to not get lost in the spreadsheets all day or the inbox, but really to step back and remember the big context and how complex making group decisions is about the planet that we live in,
Yes. And then the other thing that I would tell you, Meredith, about the many conversations that you and I have had along those 15 years, you should know that I've come to prioritize time for me to smell the flowers.
Yeah.
The flowers along the way, and knowing that nature is very resilient. So knowing that the natural world will prevail. And it's really about, when you think about conservation, it's about humanity's ability to prevail, not the natural world. Mm-hmm. So I hope that one day you and I can actually go out with the equestrian unit at the East Bay Regional Park District and enjoy those canyons and enjoy those wildflowers.
That sounds lovely. Vanessa, I think you have a last slide just to let people know. Do you want to mention what's coming up next? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I can just say it if you can't get the slide up, because the slide says, thank you. Thank you for being here. And it also says we have another lunch and learn. I think it is coming up July 20th.
Mm-hmm. Okay, finally got it. Here we go.
There's a piece of resilient nature right there. That's a mountain lion back at Arroyo Hondo within gaze of the fire. You can see the burned logs on the ground.
Yeah, really cool. I just wanted to pitch our next Lunch and Learn is going to be at the same time, 12:30 on July 20th, and it's going to be with Santa Barbara Channel Keeper, which is really cool because we're kind of continuing the same conversation that we had today about the intersectionality of different types of conservation. So they're going to be talking about how conservation of the sea connects with what we do at the Land Trust. So please sign up. I will send everyone a link to it in a thank you email soon. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for your time, everybody. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.